Here's some high-tail premium. I don't know, something. How about? I don't necessarily want to play a premium just because it's a premium. I do got a lot of premiums that are nice, but I like to play the classics too. Alright, 2-5 over here. IT1. And we'll give it a swing over here. You're not looking at the gameplay anyway, are you? Next, yeah, maybe I could throw on a documentary. Well, I'll give it, how's it?
Thank you for watching the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe. If you can support the museum, please think of backing us on Patreon. Sort of going in, being used by the German military. But they are an improvisation in many ways. So in 1934, with the situation changing with Hitler in power, the German military go back to the companies again.
This guy's a very good speaker, man. Oh, man. He knows how to talk about him. No, I gotta play the music. No, I don't know. Well, you know, maybe for this match. It'll only be a few minutes.
Mainly boosting with the idea that they are saying to them, please can you now start designing a much more sophisticated 8-wheel armoured car. And what the Germans actually do, they take the SDKFZ numbers that they've been using on these earlier general service vehicles, they take them over and replace them on, or use them again on this new series of vehicles. And that is basically the SDKFZ 231, 232, and then they do a vehicle called an SDKFZ 263, which is a much larger vehicle, doesn't have an open or turreted top. They build up the sides, and that's going to be almost like a radio communication or command centre, and they make fewer of those ones. But these vehicles, 231, they arm it with a 2 centimetre, basically the flat gun they're converting. It can fire armour-piercing rounds, a range of different shots. They actually, in the second series of more sophisticated vehicles they're designing, they do another model, the 233, which they put the short-barreled 7.5 Kurz or L24, the same gun that's on the early Panzer IVs. They put those on with a view that this will be able to give fire support to the unit. And the whole idea of these units, why they're given armament, is the insistence from the German military is they need to be able to take on a like force if they meet it. In other words, what's the enemy reconnaissance force likely to have in terms of weaponry? We need to be able to match that. What they're not expected to do is be such a powerful force that they take on every part of enemy armour, etc.
We're back in
hold your own. It's the tanks and the other forces behind you that do the most of the major part of the fighting, and you either then bail off to the flanks or carry on doing further reconnaissance work. You don't slog it out in the battle. And the 1934 version or family of vehicles are very sophisticated. They've got 8-wheel steering, they've got independent suspension, a relatively thin armour, but they are upgraded. They add about 50 centimetres in front of the vehicles later on. They add an extra armour plate to act as spaced armour later in the production run. But these vehicles, the 231 has a 2 centimetre cannon, the 232 is really a radio variant with a turret, and quite often that's aerial arrangement.
Yeah.
And the 263 version, again, high-sided, really to carry extra long-range radios. And again, that sense of, they only give it in a machine gun, an MG34, but basically for close-in defence. Again, they're looking here with the 263 version as really, again, its key weapons are those radios for communications. Now, in 1940, these vehicles were in service. We've already looked at the Lukes, the track reconnaissance vehicle, because in 1940 there was disappointment at the way that these wheeled armoured vehicles, they're great on roads, they're relatively fast, many could go over 50 miles an hour, but they're not that good cross-country. Hence programs begin for finding tracked reconnaissance vehicles, and as ever with the Germans, captured vehicles are then put into reconnaissance units. So you actually find there's never enough of these 6- and 8-wheeled armoured cars for the German military to use. So you'll find French armoured cars are being used, and at one point the 38T, the Czech tank, is also being used as a reconnaissance vehicle by some of the Panzer divisions.
Took a bite out of
now they start a new project in 1940. They're looking at tracks, but they also look at the idea of building a new 8-wheeled armoured car with the idea of hot climates in mind, so tropical. And they go to busing again with the idea, please can you help us design, and this new vehicle, again it's going to be 8-wheel drive, again it's going to have very sophisticated suspension. Again they go to Deutschenwerk at Kiel for the body, but this now is going to be a monocoque body, 30 millimetres of armour at the front, and this becomes the SD KFZ 234 series of vehicles, like the one I have next to me here. Now, they go through a series of models, and they like the idea for Tropen, the idea of hot climates, let's experiment with a diesel engine. And now we've talked about diesel and petrol in the German military before, but strategically before the war, the decision was made at a high level in the German government that diesel, heavy diesel oil, was going to be allocated only for the Navy and for submarines. The Army, the Wehrmacht, was going to only have petrol. So the petrol vehicles are what we're used to seeing with all German armoured vehicles. This is the exception. They looked at the idea of having a diesel engine as being more effective in hot climates. So for this project, they go to Tatra and they order a new diesel engine. Now that diesel engine is one of the problems this vehicle has, because in its development phase, it has a lot of problems. Way too noisy, way too many failures. And that actually extends the development time. They've got one of these vehicles running in July of 1941, but with the early engine from Tatra, it's not that successful. Production vehicles only actually start in 1944, when they've got a new diesel engine from Tatra, the 104, a 12-cylinder diesel engine, which is much quieter and much more reliable. Now, I've mentioned about the confusion about, or the issue about having diesel engines before, because for a supply chain, suddenly having two fuel types going to keep you going is going to be a problem. But having said that, when I've been trying to find any accounts, there's lots of accounts of German reconnaissance units in action. 44 onwards, there are some. They all talk about resupply. You know, we always talk about the fighting all the time, etc. So often the crews are thinking about where we're going to get petrol, where can we reload on ammunition, and of course food as well. So there is lots of talks there, but I can find no references.
So you want to talk about weapon?
Having trouble finding diesel for these engines.
4 o'clock a.m.
Maybe some of you out there, if you do find any references to that, you can put them in the comments. But to me,
you can put it in the comments.
Brand new fuel time.
TTB.
Have to find those.
Yeah, same guy as always.
Capture diesel stocks, but that's not always possible. So these engines Diesel, the only armoured vehicle that the Germans put into service with a diesel engine in. They make them in about 4 models. The SDKFZ.
Too bad it is a premium, otherwise you get the credit
bonus.
bonus.
It's the first model that they're making. That has the turret on, made by Daimler-Benz with a 2cm cannon again. That has got an open top to it, but quite often they have cages fitted to stop grenades being thrown in. These are openable cages on the top there. The second model, the SDKFZ 234/2. Now that model has an interesting turret placed on it with a 5cm anti-tank gun in. It was basically turrets that were being made for an abandoned light tank project called the Leopard or Leopard, and that project was cancelled. The turrets are left over, and they put about just over 100, I think it's about 101 of these turrets on the 234 chassis. And that again makes a powerful 5cm anti-tank gun in a rather elegant looking turret. Again, a very powerful vehicle, and this is at the order of Hitler, because going back to that original specification that reconnaissance units should be able to take on a similarly matched, in other words, reconnaissance units coming the other way. Actually, the Soviets are now starting to use tanks in their reconnaissance units. So Hitler says, you're going to need more firepower to do your jobs properly, hence the idea of this 5cm. The next model, 234/3.
5cm? I thought it was 75mm. Oh, that's a rip-off.
And that is this model here, where they put the short-barreled, or Kurtz, the short...
Jeez. No, whatever. What would be too heavy if it was 75? Maybe. And, well, we won it anyway. I thought there was only 2 guys left. Yeah, we won it anyway. Look at that. We have 1 guy that didn't even log in. Alright. So, basically, if you ask me, what was the tank that defeated Poland in 1939? Probably the Panzer II. I don't know, you could say... Honestly, I don't think they had as many numbers of the Panzer IV and the Panzer III. So, I take the Panzer II because it had the numbers. We're talking at least double, triple of what the Panzer III and Panzer IV were. Alright.
If you do like these tank chats, do please subscribe to the Tank Museum's YouTube channel. This tank chat's going to be about the SDKFZ 121. To most of us, the Panzer II, that's how we know it. Now, I've already done a tank chat on the Panzer I, and in that I've given a lot more background to that period after the First World War, the 1920s and early 1930s, where the German military and von Seeckt, how he looks at the German Commander-in-Chief rebuilding the German military, what are they going to do, how are they going to experiment, and his interest in manoeuvre warfare. So I'd strongly suggest have a look at that one if you haven't already, because the Panzer II fits into that bigger picture. The Germans at the beginning of the 1930s...
Okay, well... I'm playing PvP. And I'm playing in a Russian tank right now. Most of the vehicles I'll probably play tonight. There's a lot of there's a lot of there's a lot of Russian tanks in this game. You know, it was a Russian game. What do you expect? Well, anyway, let me play this. Damn it.
That is, they're looking at building a Panzer One that is going to be a fighting tank, but really behind it as well.
And before I continue, they didn't have the industry. That's why they lost everything. They didn't have the oil. They didn't have nothing. Mostly they didn't have the oil and they didn't have the industry. So, and Jews are fine. So, everything's great.
Well, it's a tank that's been designed and built to give the German military experience in the use of armoured vehicles. They want to build two other vehicles that ultimately become, and we know as the Panzer III and Panzer IV. Those are the vehicles they're really going to be thinking of as their main fighting tanks for the future. And I'm going to touch on a tank that comes into service or is put together as what might be called an interim model.
Why? You want me to prove it? You want me to really prove it?
German military
Look, this can pretty much prove it.
For three main purposes. They're going to see it as
proven at 3 o'clock in the morning,
weapon,
4 o'clock in the morning.
That sense,
I should have did it a lot earlier.
World War I, think of a vehicle that can cross a battlefield that might have barbed wire. It needs to crush that barbed wire, and it is proof against machine gun fire.
See those flags? That's all. That's all you gotta understand.
Battlefield. So that first role is to advance.
That's all you gotta understand.
To take machine gun fire,
what does that flag stand for? That flag doesn't stand for anti-Jews. No,
the idea there
I don't think so.
That will be a
Since when?
Support vehicle.
What history book were you reading from?
Will be, or the role they can see with a tank is for anti-tank warfare. In other words, if a tank's coming your way, you put a powerful enough gun on a mobile platform that we can then meet enemy tanks and help defend, and sometimes attack enemy tanks as well. And the third type, or the third use of the tank that the German military see, is for what they're looking at as independent operations, perhaps with other mobile or automotive vehicles. So in other words,
well,
we can see
well, it has nothing to do with the flag. Never mind. No.
What we know of now as Blitzkrieg, but mobile warfare independently. So let those tanks go and do their business, perhaps with some other types of support vehicles with them, in a much more manoeuvrist way.
See?
And the Germans, of course, really like
a
that
66
idea and want to experiment with it in the 1930s. So three different ranges. Now, the Panzer I in many ways will meet that first criteria, but it didn't necessarily. It wasn't going to perhaps be able to take on enemy tanks. They think about putting a 2-centimetre gun on it.
Poland didn't have any tanks.
And that's where Panzer II comes along. Panzer II, at the time, they come up with a production or a HIDE, a code word as it were. It's going to be LAS 100, agricultural tractor with a 100 horsepower engine, and they're looking at that one not just because
technically they did.
We're
they had
having
a few,
real trouble in the background.
But they didn't make it. They didn't make much of an impact.
Threes and Panzer IVs
it's called the 7TP.
Coming down the line. So we're going to need something a little bit
7-ton tank
than the Panzer I that is already starting to go
based on the
its
Vickers
development and then production phase. So that's where they come up with the
During
idea of the
same,
Panzer II. They
time
look at
period.
the Panzer I. They, in many ways, a Panzer II is a slightly enlarged version. They set out a specification for the Panzer II that's going to be, it's about 6 tons. They want about 10 millimeters, maybe a bit more of armour plate on it. But the key thing is they want the 2-centimetre KWK L55 gun put on it. It's called the L30 gun. It's basically the Flak 30 that has been converted for use in a tank. And they see that in the early 1930s as being a good enough weapon to go through, back then, most of the known light tanks that are out there. They also know, they're not naive, they know later on that it is not going to be an effective weapon against heavily armoured tanks. So it's not thought of in that way. So the Waffen-Amt, the German military authorities, issue out this specification. Krupp and Daimler get in there very early, but then they open it out to further competition. and along comes Mann and also Henschel, they're involved. They all go away, they come back within a year with some prototype vehicles that are then tested, and in the end, the model that is taken forward, the two companies that are in essence chosen, they look at Mann for the chassis below, the track system, etc., and then they look at Daimler-Benz for doing the superstructure and the turret on the top. And they, in essence, become what nowadays we might call the parent body for the manufacturer. When it comes to the manufacturer, many other companies are involved, and a large number of those earlier mentioned manufacturers, they're actually involved in the process as well. But there's almost like a design authority.
This Abrams X done.
And MAN. Now they start this process, this is 1934 when they've been putting out the orders for doing this. What's an interesting one is that the Germans at the time realised, because of the problems they've already got, they are new to this tank building business in quantity. So, as we've mentioned on some of the other tank chats, they've got major issues in the 30s about actually getting effective systems and subsystems to work, getting the manufacturing capacity built up, and delays always come in this. And I just want to read you a small document that actually cites, and it's a contemporary document that cites how the Germans, it's really interesting to see how they look at the problem they're going to face. It is necessary to test all of these experimental models over long distance. In addition, it is absolutely necessary to detect and correct any weaknesses in the design by subjecting a model to test firing and explosions. The time needed for these tests is lengthy. Failures occur, parts disassemble, and this requires a long time. Design modifications are initiated, followed by reassembly and further testing.
Ahead of me.
Tests of the replaced part must start again at 0 mileage. Based on experience, conversion to series production is certain to bring considerable difficulties that must be overcome on a case-by-case basis. Similar problems have been experienced throughout the entire weapons field. When industry can deliver heavy Panzerkampfwagen types is not the only concern. The first prerequisite must be that a mature design has been created. If the schedule for series production is rushed, backfit modifications are unpreventable and expensive, as far as they are even possible. The combat value of the Panzer may be reduced to scrap value. This would also result in delaying systematic development of the equipment that is technically superior to foreign equipment. So they are really clear, the German military are really clear that that testing regime is essential if they're going to get a worthwhile product. So you're seeing it becomes rather confusing that once they've picked that first design, they then start making Ausrungs, but with a small letter, as opposed to the big letter. The small letter of these pre-production series that they're doing in batches of 25, A1, A/1, A/2, etc., and they go on to B and C. And all of these early ones, again, you can follow, if you're very clever about the imagery, you can look at all the pictures and work out which one's which, as they are coming to ultimately a design that becomes capital letter A, the Ausrung A. In other words, the ones that are going to go into production. And they start that production in 1936, and they even then, it's well over a year before those first Panzer II tanks actually reach the field army, so that they can start actually really operating and trialling with them. So this again, it sounds like a long process, it's quite quick compared to modern tank design, but actually they are adamant that they need to go through this various types of experimental process. So what have they got with that early series of Panzer IIs? They end up with about 10 millimeters of armour on the front. The KWK gun that they're putting on it, this KWK-30, the 2 centimetre gun, it will go through at about 700 metres, 10 millimetres of armour. And again, so from their point of view, they realise they want their tanks to have slightly more. So straight away, they're upping the armour as part of the specification, and they think 15 millimetres is a minimum for production tanks when they actually go into service. Again, on those
basically, this thing's only got maximum 15 millimeters.
You'll see a very different suspension. It's a suspension that is being copied from the Panzer I. A lot of the ideas and the fundamental shape for now developing into a 6-ton vehicle come from the Panzer I. But by the end of those test vehicles, they've got the familiar suspension that we're used to seeing now on most of the Panzer IIs, which is a kind of crank arm suspension, 5 rubber road wheels or rubber coated road wheels, an arm with a springing system on the top. So again, that goes into, with the first Alf A, capital letter Alf A, that's what you'll see going into production. Relatively narrow tracks. The turret system, again, that familiar faceted tape turret system that you're looking on, and they're looking at for those first production vehicles, as well as a 3-man crew. So inside there, you've got a driver in the front. As you face the vehicle, he's on the right-hand side. Behind sits a radio operator. He's not actually in the front of the tank, he actually goes behind the driver. And then up in the turret, you've got the commander who operates that 2-centimetre gun. He's got magazines of 8 rounds. It's a semi-automatic weapon, and about 180 rounds of this 2-centimetre ammunition is carried actually inside the tank. For the production vehicles, they end up going for the petrol engine, the Maybach HL 62 TRM engine. That's the one that powers it around. It will give the early models of the vehicles about 25 miles an hour. Later on, they get up to about 35 miles an hour.
Basically, I don't give a shit about any of those except for credits.
20 miles on the road.
And I ain't even playing for credits.
They've got there a tank which now again, and so often happens, people look back on and think it's rather small, a bit fairly weak. Actually, as a contemporary tank,
I feel like the T-80
right much
now.
That was going on around it. And again, in those early days, remembering that the German military are really looking at enemies, their biggest concern early on in the early 30s is still looking at Poland rather than France, and the bigger tanks that the French then start coming out towards the end of the 30s. Now those production tanks that go out there,
they're all nice,
produced
they are.
in Alfram A, B and C, the first 3 main models. There's very little differences. Now they've done their experimentation between those first 3 production models. Really the difference there between A, B and C is because what happens is the German military are thinking what becomes of Panzer III and Panzer IV will be ready. Actually, they're not ready, so they say to the factories, right, here's another order, keep making what we know as the Panzer II, and so they end up calling, for example, Alfram C. It's pretty much the same as B and A before, it's just got slightly different visors on it. The real reason there's a new model is because the new order has come to the factories. Now, by 1939, the Germans are very fully aware that actually on the battlefield, they've had experience in the Spanish Civil War, then they go into Poland, that the armour thickness on the Panzer II is not really up to the modern battlefield. So even though they've done that experimentation, they've done all that, they've mentioned in their document, they have to go back and retrofit extra armour on many of the vehicles. And that retrofit, so for example, they put 20mm extra armour on curves around the front of the turret there. They'll have extra armour bolted onto the front to thicken it up. All of those come out in kits, and they're issued to the field army. By May of 1940, when the fighting starts and the invasion of France, Belgium and Holland, not all the tanks have been upgraded. Now, interesting, there's about 1,300 Panzer IIs are now in service with the German army. They hadn't really expected to build that many, but it was this idea of keeping the production line going. And that makes up for the invasion of France in May of 1940. So that means the Panzer II is about 36% of the 2,500 odd German and Czech tanks that are actually used in that invasion. So that's a really sizable proportion there. In fact, they're the most numerous German tank that's being used in the invasion.
I still don't see a 7v7 over here.
Actually, the German panzer divisions that get so much attention in that campaign, there's only 16
well, that could be because I'm playing lower tier.
Panzer motorized divisions in the 150 plus divisions in the German military.
Of course, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give up.
Divisions, 6 motorized, and that means that this rather small tank is actually a significant part of that victory in 1940, what Hitler calls the miracle with the breakthrough at Sedan, and the advance through the Ardennes forest, and the speed that the Germans operate which causes really
Light
for the
tank,
French
very
army
light
and
tank,
certainly the
yeah.
British as well, those problems. And again, so it's the speed of this tank and the way that it's being operated, not its relatively
Yuka right there, strong
small
one.
firepower, its small armor protection levels, all of that. That's not what's doing the victory. What is doing the victory is how it's being used, the tactical use of this tank for a great strategic outcome. And what's really going on, and if you look at some of the German reports and the orders that are given beforehand, they are saying to the tank commanders, they know the armour protection on this is not very good, so they're saying to the commanders, race towards the enemy anti-tank guns, try to keep manoeuvre, and the French actually respond to this. They actually, some of the French reports are their anti-tank guns, which are very powerful, very good, probably one of the best ones on the battlefield. Actually, they can't, they find the mobility of the tanks coming towards them the problem about trying to knock them out. So that's where they find their problems there. So the commanders are told to use their mobility and their speed, and one of the great things about the Panzer divisions from the Germans' point of view is that sense of they are using this battle like a sprint. The French military are looking like this as they're coming to it as if it's going to be a long distance run, and everything that goes on is the German military are getting inside that decision-making process of the French army. So tanks like this, again, already by May of 1940, they're looking a little bit smaller than the other tanks that are there. The Germans are starting to get their Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs into service, now in better numbers. Actually, very quickly, the Panzer II is being outclassed and is starting to get relegated to other roles. But that moment, this is one of those key vehicles that really, at the iconic moment of the German military in May of 1940, defeating that much bigger French, British, Belgium armies and those better tanks that were lined up against them. So that's its really great moment in history. Now with the Panzer II, they carry on the development. So we've had A, B and C models. D and E, they changed the suspension to torsion bar. They don't make that many of
basically,
them.
we
What ends
got
up happening is some of
3
those
more
ones that
human
used in
beings
front,
on
they're
our
actually
team.
withdrawn, and most of those are then converted into flamethrower tanks. They in turn aren't that successful, so many of those then get go back to the factories.
You wanna play, really?
As a lot of
MBT, he's the
are
most
either
important guy.
rebuilt or the later models
Oh
being
my
built,
God,
they
they're
use
all
for
here.
other roles
They're
rather
all
than a turreted
here.
gun tank, as it were.
They're all
so
here.
They start ending up being the
Guess
chassis
what?
used for Vespers or
Kill the
self-propelled
ISU,
artillery.
kill the SU.
Some are used, their
Take
turrets
some
are
cover.
taken off and they're used as ammunition carriers.
Lower plate.
And some of these Panzer II turrets
man.
you'll see are then reused as
He's gonna
defensive
push me.
positions on things
Alright,
like the Atlantic
fine.
Wall,
MBT
static
70.
positions, so they're being reused. They stopped
Okay.
actually making the Panzer II
He signed
in
the
January
game
of 1944,
2 minutes ago.
although you'll still see them being used in various capacities.
He's
They
using
use them
Philip,
relegated
whatever the
to
hell
other
his name
roles,
is,
sometimes
first commander you
reconnaissance,
get.
sometimes internal security duties. A lot of them are used for training. So their real moment comes early on in 1940, certainly in the invasion of Russia as well, but then you'll be seeing them used in those secondary roles rather than as a frontline battle tank all the time.
Alright.
This particular model
no,
that
bro.
I'm standing next to is
No,
again is a later
bro.
model.
You know,
They go for that D&E,
play
they
some
then
more
go
tonight
on
in Riviera.
with F and a number of other models where they actually go back to the original suspension system.
I actually like
They
Tier
thicken
9
the armour,
well.
they slightly change the shape of the front. Again, if you look, there's plenty of books out there where you can follow all the different modifications. Like so many German
Right,
tanks
Tier
even
9,
within that model,
right.
there's a change
So,
goes on throughout. And again, on
I
this
think
one,
Tier 9, what do you
even
think?
though this one was actually
Jeez.
sent out, it's built in
Abrams.
1942,
Leopard.
it's sent out to North Africa and it's captured in Tunisia, brought back for evaluation here as an F model. There's some little details that are always interesting to look at. One of the things they picked up on was the idea that if you haven't got the weapon to penetrate armour, you tend to aim for what you know are going to be vulnerable points, in other words, vision slits, the sighting systems, etc. So some of the early Panzer II had a little dummy cone on top of the turret. That was to look like that's where the sight was for the gun. In fact, the sights for the main weapons always being in the middle of the mantlet. And on this one, what they did with the F model, they've actually put on the other side for the driver another dummy vision port with the idea that people might shoot at that rather than the actual place where the real driver's looking out. And he's got his optics there as well, looking through as well, a periscopic system in there. So on the vehicle, By this stage, they've got up to about 35 millimeters of armour protection on the front, so it's much, much thicker. For the L model of the Panzer II, and we'll talk about that one probably as a separate tank chat, that's a Lux, which is a very...
This is the bread and butter,
really
man.
Morphed into a completely
like,
different tank there. So,
of
really,
tank history documentaries. It's all about the German army.
That's the end of the main production of
like,
the standard, as we call it, Panzer II tank.
Yeah,
so again,
Russian
in this
armor
one you
too.
can see there's a new cupola
Especially
on the top,
World War II.
For the commander, so he's got all-round vision. Different bins, again, as you look along the side.
Because if you ask me, who had the better armored vehicles, the Americans, the Russians, or the Germans? I would say the Russians all the way.
This model, they've now brought the radio operator
Why?
to sit next to the driver.
Well,
so he's up the front.
Number one,
different shape.
They had the T-34 and the KV-1 in service in 1941 while the Germans were invading, and when they encountered them, they could not penetrate them whatsoever, and they had a nightmare situation. And then later in the war, they upgraded the T-34 to the T-34-85, which is a higher caliber gun than the Sherman, which was in, the Western Front, which didn't exist. The Russian Front existed from 1941 to 1945. The American Front, the Western Front, didn't exist until the middle of 1944 to 1945. May 8th. So.
If you like these films, please do subscribe to the Tank Museum's YouTube channel. And if you can,
but we were in other places. We were in Africa. We were in Italy. We were in the Pacific with the Japanese. So there's other places that you got to consider as well.
I would say, if you don't agree with me, then just keep it to yourself. Hi, I'm David Fletcher, and I've been asked to give you a talk about my 5 worst tanks. I'm not doing the best, because that's been done before. I'm going to do the 5 most awful tanks we've got. Because we're doing it in the Tank Museum, and because it's mainly British tanks in here, that's what you'll see. I can't do foreign ones because we haven't got any really awful foreign tanks in the collection. But for British ones, we've got some hideous things, and I hope you'll enjoy watching them, if nothing else. Now, this is my number 5, and it's the British Charioteer. It was actually a post-war tank, but just so that you know, it's this yellow one on my right. Not this thing on my left, which is the AMX-13 that somebody's put in here. We've had to come into a dark and dingy corner of the VCC to see it, and you'll see that the tank itself has been shoved up against another tank here. You can't move down the side of it, you can't get behind it, and the turret's been reversed. Apart from that, it's perfect. But that's just the way I want to talk about it. Now, the Charioteer was built in a hurry, and it was an improvisation. At the time, Major General Duncan was Director Royal Armoured Corps, and he was very concerned that we would soon be at war with the Russians. He never said the Russians, but since we're very rarely likely to be at war with anybody else, we assumed it was the Russians. Now, he therefore decided that the Cromwell tank would have to go into action again after the Second World War. But the Cromwell had a 75mm gun, which wouldn't even have scratched the heavy Russian tanks. So General Duncan suggested that he wanted the 20-pounder, the new gun for the Centurion, and he wanted that on a Cromwell chassis. Now, he went to various people like FVRDE, who were the designers, and told them what he wanted, and left it to the technicians to design the tank. And Charioteer was the result. In fact, it's a horrible thing. The turret, besides being enormous, and it has to be enormous, because to give the gun any sort of elevation, you need to have it all above the level of the hull. They did enlarge the turret ring I don't know how they did that without upsetting the tank, but they managed to enlarge the turret ring, but still not enough to get the gun to go up and down. So the turret had to be bigger so that the gun could do that. Now the turret itself would have weighed so much that it would have ruined the tank. So the turret has armour 1.5 inches thick at the front, which isn't very much at all, but it's even worse at the sides. The sides of this turret are 1 inch thick. That's about 25 millimetres. It's nothing. And it means that the thing is virtually destroyable by anything that cares to fire at it. And sending it out even with a bigger gun wasn't much of an advantage, because it was, whatever happened, it was going to get hit and the crew were going to get killed. They'd done away with the front hull machine gunner, although they sometimes sat a man in there in supreme discomfort, and otherwise it was the ordinary Cromwell chassis, powered by the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine and Christie suspension. It had, it was quite automotively quite a good chassis, but this turret and gun ruined it. The gun is what we called the 20-pounder in those days. It's about 84 millimetres calibre, and it was a very powerful anti-tank gun. But in this thing, and this mounting, absolutely useless. Now you could say that Charioteer was a tank destroyer, like the American vehicles, because they were often quite lightweight and designed to destroy tanks and not worry too much about incoming fire. The trouble is that Charioteer's got a coaxial machine gun, and with a that's a machine gun alongside the main gun, and anything with a coaxial machine gun is automatically a tank. And these things were issued to the British Territorial Army as their only tank available to defeat the big Russian tanks, and they wouldn't stand a chance, but that's how it was done. And it's really the turret that makes it such an awful tank, and that's why it's on my list. But I'll tell you a bit of the story about Charioteer. Apart from seeing a bit of service with the Territorial Army, they were mostly sold abroad. Countries like Austria and Finland bought them. They were supplied to the Lebanon and Jordan as tanks. They weren't all that effective, but in those days we didn't worry too much. As long as someone brought them and got them off our hands, we were quite happy. Got rid of the running tanks, and that was all that mattered. This one was actually kept as a sample, and that's why we've got it at Bovington. We've since painted it up in the markings of the Arab Legion, so it's shown as a Jordanian tank. But it never was. It never left this country, this particular one. And it really is one of the most dreadful tanks that's ever been produced. One of the problems they found with it was that when they fired the gun, it produced such a huge dense cloud of smoke that the commander couldn't see what he'd hit or fired at. So quite often, if he could manage it, the commander dismounted and walked to one side or the other to where he could see, and had the fourth man, the chap who was sat down here, hauled into the turret and made the gunner. He fired the gun. He couldn't see what he was firing at, but the commander could. But you're not supposed to do things like that with a tank. It's silly. But that's the sort of thing they had to do to make Charioteer effective. And if the Russians had allowed us to do that, fine, but they wouldn't, of course. They had powerful tanks. They could knock out our tanks easily. And this was the easiest one of all to knock out. So that's really why I've elected to include it in my list of the worst tanks. Now, Black Prince is on my list of worst tanks, and you may wonder why.
Alright, so I want to show you the big guys. Of course, one of my favorites. Come on. How can you deny this guy? The ISU-152. This guy was created in World War II by the Russians.
If you remember the Red Army around mid-1943 or so, and you wished to remove a building, or maybe half a city block, which offended you, you could do a lot worse than to call upon the services of an Su-152. Now, by September 43, work had started on producing a successor to this vehicle. Prototype produced October, and it entered production in December of 43. That vehicle was the ISU-152, and we're back in Padakova to have a look at the one right behind me. Now, compared to its predecessor, it took a couple of lessons. It had a different steering mechanism, had different sights, and most importantly, it also had a fair bit more armor. It's 90 millimeters as compared to the 60 of its predecessor. Have a look at this in the normal manner outside first, and then we're going to have a hop inside. I think I'll fit in this one. It looks like the crew compartment is big enough. The ISU was of course built on the IS series of heavy tanks. Early production versions would have a cast nose plate such as this one. Later versions would have a welded one. Now you can tell just how early this particular vehicle was by again looking at the serial number, which is engraved both on the front slope and on the driver's visor. If you have a look, the first three numbers are 241, which is the object code. Next number is the digit 4, means 1944 was the year of manufacture, 03 March. The next couple of digits, which are 154, indicate that this was the 154th vehicle of that type to roll off the production line. Another point to note though, this is a modernized ISU. Items such as the grilled-in headlights, they were a post-war modification. We'll see a couple of other changes from the original configuration as we walk around. Other things you see on the front of the vehicle, firstly of course, the horn, gotta have that. And for close-in defense, it was possible to shoot your personal weapons out of two little portholes, one of which has been welded over on this side, the one on the right-hand side still remains. Tow hooks, lots of spare track link, and of course, a big gun. As we go a little bit further around the side, this is another post-war modification, this little rack here for toolkit. These little notches, for lack of a better term, are mounting points for a canvas cover if you wanted to put one on top of the mantlet. Now, this brings us to the armor. It's mentioned superior to that of the Su-152. Frontal plate 90 at 30 degrees. The two side plates of the cabin are 75 millimeters angled on the vertical plane at 15 degrees, and they're also angled inwards on the horizontal plane. Going a little bit further back again, indicator light, Pioneer tools. As you move further to the rear, external fuel stowage. The vehicles came with 4 90-litre external tanks. Now, unlike some other vehicles like the T-34, these external tanks were part of the fuel system. There was piping between the tanks which would come forward and enter into the internal fuel tanks. Now, there's a catch. These are not the original external tanks. As near as we can tell, these are air compressor tanks which got mounted and pressed into service. The landing gear is lifted straight from the IS. There are 6 pairs per side of steel road wheels. Now, solid steel, there's no rubber tires, although I am told that there is rubber on the inside in a manner similar to
Ethan looked a little bit younger back then.
They're mounted on torsion bar suspensions, each of which has, of course, its own independent
about
arm,
10 years
with
ago.
a bump stop to stop the arm going too far and snapping the torsion bar. Idler wheel looks very similar to the road wheel, although I'm told they are slightly different. The track lengths are 650 millimeters wide and of a fairly simple cast construction. Unlike a lot of other vehicles that the Soviets had, all the links here are identical. They all have a single center guide. Single pin construction, the pins are held in place by means of a clip and a washer. Track tension, simple old school type. There is a simple thread system. You remove a locking plate, you get a big wrench, turn the thread, it'll move the idler forwards and backwards. Hey presto, your track is tension. Coming around to the back of the vehicle, again we maintain the sloped aspect of the rear armor, possibly a little unnecessary. there are multiple ways of accessing the interior. Now you have for routine maintenance these two hatches here which will access the transmission. An interesting feature I know you don't see much on Soviet vehicles is rubber pads for when you open it up it's not going to snap on the metal. If you have to do a little bit more major work, undo the bolts on the outside of this panel here. Again, it's rubber sealed, torsion bar on the hinge comes out easily enough. And if you have to do some very significant work, there are lots more bolts and you can take off the entire back panel. The fuel tanks, another post-war modification as it's hypothesized possibly off the T-72, not original. Further down, tow hooks. And there are marker lights, such as this one here. As we come around the left-hand side, another post-war modification is the location of the log. Now, on the Russian forum it keeps coming up, why is this guy always talking about the log, as if it's something interesting? Well, actually it is, because only you guys have them. Now, for those of us in the West who don't know what the log is for, it's run ditching. Or if you get stuck in mud, you chain the log crosswise at the front of the track, you go forward with the track a half track length. That should give you enough traction to get out of the mud or off the high center or whatever it is that you're on. Put the log back on the side and away you go. Finally, just above the left side third road wheel, you have a hatch here. This is for easy loading of the ammunition so you don't have to hoist 152mm rounds all the way up to the top and then all the way back down again. When you climb up to the engine deck of the ISU, it's very similar to most of the other vehicles. It's very heavily armored. Air vents on the side, big cooling vent at the rear of the transmission compartment.
Oh, look at that.
Unfortunately,
that was
the little dome here coming to the IS series, which is for the coolant system, it kind of gets in the way of where you want to sleep. But you can at least get two people sleeping on the back deck here. Not too bad. It should be nice and warm if the engine has been going around all day.
What do you think about Polka, my Russian
Underneath
friend?
the engine deck, if I open it up, it's going to be the B2IS.
USA. Hey. What do you think about that? Oh, man. Probably never.
This is a heavy
You never been there
deck.
before, have you?
Fortunately, as you can see, there's an access plug here, so you can access the coolant reservoir without too much difficulty, without having to lift the whole thing up. The B2IS itself is a 520 horsepower diesel. It has a multi-cyclone air filter. In cases of starting in extreme cold weather, there is a heater in the air filter itself. So it sprays fuel in, there's a high voltage spark plug that starts to ignite the incoming air to make it nice and warm, make it easier to start. The coolant system also has a wick heater of its own, also powered by the diesel. That heater not only heats the coolant so that it's not frozen when you're trying to start the engine, but it also is the crew compartment heater as well. Combine this with the compressed air starting system, and this is very much a vehicle designed to operate and survive in cold weather environments. So I'm going to drop the cover right now. Hopefully without breaking my back. The armored concept extends, again, like a lot of the Soviet tanks, to even the oil and fuel filler caps. You get your square wrench. You know, a lot of unscrewing. Fortunately, we've already loosened this. And you can just see how thick this piece of metal is. There's access to fuel filler down here. Two exhausts, one on each side. As you can see, it deflects sideways right over the fuel tank. On the plus side, it's diesel. It's probably not going to do any harm. There's a lot of negative thought about the concept of an external fuel tank. And in reality, it's not as big an issue as a lot of people say it is. For starters, it's probably empty by the time you get into battle if you haven't ditched it. Secondly, if it's a full tank, it's not going to ignite because there's no oxygen to do so. If it does get perforated, if the fuel leaks off from the side, it's burning on the outside of the tank. If it's burning at all, otherwise it's just on the ground. Not such a huge problem. Alright, if you look at the back of the superstructure, large two-piece hatch on the loader side makes ingress very, very easy. The top obviously folds forwards and the back folds down. Now, it's a little bit stiff on this model, so I'm cheating. can see how thick the hatch is. It's not a lightweight device, held in place by a couple of clamps here. Again, the back of the tank, sorry, assault gun, 75 millimeters, quite thickly armored. Put the tank bar down. As we move further off to the right, there is a third port here for personal weapons, some machine gun. And you can put a pintle up here for a machine gun which could be operated by crew sitting on the back, or because the breech operator's hatch is on a ring, it is possible to simply swivel the gun around to the front and the breech operator can operate the machine gun that way. Now the crew are quite well equipped with hatches. In addition to the large loaders and the breech operator's hatch, the front right the commander has his own, and the front left the driver has his own. Just to the front left of the driver's hatch you'll see a small little port. That's for the driver's fuel tank.
Bertino's almost dead.
And top center
That's,
is another housing for a ventilator.
That's pretty much
part
one of
one.
the
Part
most
two, of
lethal
course,
guys
we go
I've
inside.
seen. That's basically let's do I'm gonna go on a secret mission with you.
Welcome back. T-3485, Part 2. Turret and interior.
There. Oh. For this match, sure.
Now, the turret, of course, big difference between this and the earlier model to accommodate the larger gun. Also meant you had a 3-man crew. This was great. The TC could actually spend his time commanding the tank, not having to do multiple duty. Now, initially, T-3485 turrets had about 75 millimeters of armor on the front and were 52 on the side and rear. However, later models, by the end of 1944, you started looking at about 90 millimeters in front and 75 sides and rear. The turret was of cast construction, although the roof was a simple flat sheet of metal which got welded in place. TC, of course, has his own cupola now. It's a fixed cupola, the vision ports are fixed, can't rotate them around, but he can rotate the roof with the hatch. So by lifting up on the lever here, it's on rollers, it rotates fairly simply. Now the hatch itself, as I lock this back into place, very simple one piece. It's locked in place by a simple locking latch, and there is a torsion bar spring to help
so basically,
that's the outside.
Well, it's pretty even match
is
right now.
not really the most comfortable I've ever been in. It's actually a good incentive for you to fight with your head out. Now, for reasons which elude me, it seems that TC has a choice of two different foot pedals. The first one is below the gunner seat. In order to get it to fold down, you have to lift up the gunner seat to give it room. You can then let the gunner seat fold down. Now with this set of foot pedals, he's aiming pretty much his legs in a forward direction, so he's quite comfortable. The downside though is that with his knees lower down, he has more risk of hitting the gunner in the back. The other set of footrest, which is part of the gunner seat itself, the advantage now is my knees have been lifted up and not quite as intruding into the gunner space. The downside though is now my legs are angled over at 40 degrees, and so I'm fighting with my body twisted, and it doesn't strike me as being particularly comfortable for any length or duration. To see out, TC's not doing too badly. He's got 5 of these individual vision ports around here, which if it looks like you're taking fire, you can actually pull down, and that will protect the port. To his front, he has a binocular or unity sight, which is adjustable in elevation and, in theory, traverse, although this one's a little bit stiff. He doesn't have any other controls. He's along for the ride, no TC's override. He's got some stowage facilities around him, so it looks a little bit sparse, but otherwise, his job is quite simply command the tank. Probably a nice relief for T-34 commanders that used to have to do multiple duty in earlier versions of the tank. Other than that, about the only thing I can say is, if I've got no gunner, I can stretch my legs out and I can still actually control the tank turret and get her around. not really a three-man crew because you got no sight, but it's comfortable. The better way, of course, to control the gun is from the gunner seat, so that's where I go next.
Okay, my question is this the T-74? I mean, the T-34-76 or the T-70?
Alright,
The
so this is an example of
T-34-85.
elegance in operation. It's a crude tank, but it can also be elegant. So you sit in here and go, well,
We're gonna
where
get this
is
guy.
the control for the power traverse?
That was
Because
a big
obviously you've
hit
got
right
manual
there.
traverse. Yeah, manual elevation. Where is power traverse? Because ordinarily you're
That was a big hit.
controls. Well, no, not in this. They save space. All you do is you move the manual control to the top left, pull out the handle, and you're now in power traverse mode. It's not precise, but it's a lot faster than cranking. So if I try spinning to the right, power!
You gonna play with me? Or did I get your friend?
Alright, so similarly, going back,
Like what?
again, note how there is momentum in the turret, how it continues to spin even after I
Really?
go back to the zero position. So this is purely a case of
Santara, you better
traversing
be back
quickly
there. You
to
better
get
be doing
roughly on target.
Come on, push. Go ahead.
More or less straight. Then you go back to manual mode,
No.
and that's how you conduct your final lay and
No,
service the target that way. And again, you
done
saw
with
how
you.
fast this thing spins. Being a loader, holding that
Come
big
on, man. He
85
keeps
millimeter
on
round,
missing. He keeps
as the
on
turret
missing.
spinning around unpredictably, of course.
I'm
when
at
you
full
don't
hit
control
points.
it.
He's at one. He's
You
at
want to
one.
pay attention. To engage the target, the gunner is supposed to have a TSH-15 sight.
You
As you can see, somewhat missing. It did have an electrical light
He's
bulb,
dead.
so it had an illuminated reticle for
So the
firing at
Puma
night.
next.
And by January of 45, it also came with a heater to prevent from fogging. The primary toy is the S53 85mm cannon. 54.6
So the
caliber
Centauro
plate,
was
and
making
there's
me
56
right.
rounds to play with. Maximum service range, 5,200 meters. The gun has two ways of firing, electrical or manual. The electrical trigger is located on the elevation handle. The manual trigger is located next to the solenoid here. It would be a string that you pull and that will release the firing pin. Just behind the solenoid and manual firing trigger is an elevation quadrant. You can use this to engage targets at night if you're firing from a range card, for example. So you can actually
He's
see the
dead.
target, you
He's
know what
dead.
range it is.
Alright,
All alternatively,
load up
perhaps
the
with
HE.
indirect fire, although without
All I gotta
an
do is splash him.
indicator,
All I gotta do is tap
It's
him.
not a precise one. I'm not entirely sure how that will be performed.
Alright, he's
There
dead.
is a basic azimuth indicator. on
We
the left-hand
won!
side. It's a simple pointer. There's a graduated scale.
Game-winning
on each
killer
side
right
of the
there.
grade, and it'll give you an approximate idea of what way you're facing compared to the hull. To his front, he has the selectors for the main gun and the coaxial machine gun. And curiously, you can have them both on or both off at the same time. I'm not entirely sure that's the way it's supposed to work. So we'll have main on and coax off. The coaxial is a 7.62mm DP, and he has over 1,800 rounds of ammunition to play with in drums. To his left, he has a pistol port. There's another one on the other side of the turret. You unscrew it, bring it down. You can then push out the port plug.
Yeah, that was a
Engage targets with
6
what we usually revolver.
V6.
It was preferred by the tankers over the semi-auto, apparently. And just pull back in. lock it in
33K
place.
Anophilia.
Off you go. Last thing on the right hand side.
So that's the. Actually, that was the T-34 85. I'm sure he said it because the difference between the T-34 76 and the T-34 85 is that the T-34 originally is actually only a two-man turret, but they upgraded it to a three-man turret in the T-34 85. So. Commander, gunner, and loader. Before they only had commander and gunner. So. And then one of those crew members will double as a loader. So here is the original T-34.
This tank chat's going to be about the very famous Soviet tank, the T-34. We're going to look at the T-34-76, this model, and also a look at a T-34-85. Now, this tank, it's quite hard to explain and talk about because it is surrounded by such a history and such a number of myths. And it's become an iconic vehicle for Soviet Russia and that great patriotic war. So we're going to try and take some of those issues apart as we look at it. This particular T-34-76 is a very early one, and we're very fortunate to have it here. It was actually captured by the Finnish forces in the continuation war. There's the Winter War of 39-40. Later on, later 41, the war begins again against the Soviet Union. And the Finns capture a number of vehicles, including this very early T-34. They put it into service themselves. And this particular vehicle, it's got modifications on it that the Finns did, and it was actually still in service as a training vehicle into the 1950s with the Finnish military. The swastika on the side, that by the way is a Finnish symbol that's been used by their military. It's nothing to do with Nazism. People often wonder why that's on there. The fact they happen to be fighting on the German side against Soviet Russia, that's one of those coincidences. But again, so this particular vehicle, it's on loan to the Tank Museum, and we're very grateful for the Finns for lending it to us. Now, we need to start back with what's the Red Army up to in terms of its use of tanks. The Red Army is first formed in 1918, and it takes a number of Tsarist officers into its formation. It looks at what the best way for the Red Army to fight a future war is going to be, and it studies quite a number of different developments, even studies like the Commonwealth use of combined arms at the Battle of Amiens. It looks at a whole range of different issues, and there is a massive debate within the Soviet military hierarchy about how should we fight a war in the future. Now, one of the people, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, is looking at the idea of using armoured forces for a type of warfare that at one point gets called the warfare of annihilation. Let's have the Red Army as a massive, very sophisticated, technologically advanced force which will deliver a crushing blow onto any enemy. There's another school of thought that argues along the lines of saying, no, let's use Russia's great country, its depth, let's go along the way of a sort of sense of attrition rather than annihilation. And that traditionally, that attritional warfare is how Russia's fought wars in the past. Now, these debates go on. 1929, Stalin comes to power. He decides he's going to back Mikhail Tukhachevsky's ideas, and he's going to, Tukhachevsky's actually even arguing to say, let's industrialize the whole of Soviet society to build not things like freezers or fridges for the homes. Let's do it to build tanks, aeroplanes, and make us this great military power. Now, Stalin knows he's about to start implementing the 5-year plan. He's going to back Tukhachevsky because he likes that as an idea, and he also needs the Red Army on his side as he's going to implement all these future plans. Now, in 1930 then, out go Red Army agents to buy from Britain the Vickers export tank, and from America they buy a couple of examples and a license for the Walter Christie tank that hasn't gone into production in America but has that famous Christie suspension on, a very fast vehicle. And in Russia, these vehicles, the Vickers export tank is developed into the T-26 tank, and it is started to be built in huge numbers in Russia. And with the Christie tank, it becomes the BT series
Germany
of tanks.
rally
Again,
location.
these are going to be
I'll take
fast, quick-moving vehicles that are going to be the equivalent of cavalry tanks. T-26, much more the infantry tanks.
Germany.
Now, those vehicles take time to build in the factories, and Russia also has a problem of industrialization.
I won't even look at what they
plans.
look like.
How do we actually push through an industrialization process? So again, from America,
I know they're
the
UK and
Soviets
all like
bring
that
in
one.
Alfred Kahn, who's an American designer of factories,
This is
and
all
he
I'm
ends
buying.
up building huge numbers
I'm
of
not buying
factories
no other-
to
no
help
other
the
steam
Russians
crap.
build this new tank fleet. The famous
Finland? Oh, yeah, I'm getting that one.
Stalingrad tractor factory is actually one of Alfred Kahn's creations.
Uh.
Now, that process of building these vehicles, some
Greece?
of them are not built to a great standard. The Russians have a lot of trouble with their metallurgy, so some of the early tracks are
Finland,
fairly
I'm
weak.
getting it.
And by 1937, they're already looking at what might be the replacement vehicle, certainly for the BT series of vehicles. Now, this is when the designer of the T-34, Mikhail Koshkin, comes into the picture. He's working at the Kharkov locomotive, or Comintern locomotive factory it's called. Basically, they're building tanks there. And he's set the task of, can he build a replacement for the BT tank? And his first model that he comes out with is something called the A-20. It's got sloped armour, it's got a 45mm gun, it's going to have potentially a diesel engine in the back.
Where is the UK
and
one?
it's also one of these ones, they call it 8x6. It's actually got 6 of the road wheels are powered by the engine, as were the BT series. And that dates back to the fact that early track technology was a bit unreliable. If you could run your vehicle on wheels on the roads till you need the tracks, that would be better. Now, the problem with that, it means extra technology, lots of extra complexity to the design and build of the vehicle. And that idea is fairly rapidly dropped in this A-20 prototype. 20mm of frontal armour, nicely sloped. But again, we're looking
got
at
reviews
1937
mostly
here.
positive.
1938 with Lake Kazan, 1939 with Khalkhin Gol. Lots of lessons are learned from these battles. And what comes back is the use of the T-26 and the BT tanks, issues such as the wells not being very good.
Continue to
the
pay
enemy
me.
anti-tank guns,
Don't
even though
mind
they
me.
weren't that powerful, could penetrate the armour.
Okay.
So Koshkin has a rethink, and he goes back to Stalin and the Red Army and said, look, shouldn't we build something more powerful, thicker armour protection, all-rounder better tank, and
Thank you,
perhaps
April. I
even
appreciate
a
it.
universal tank? In other words, this could be a tank that takes over from the BT series and also the
Most
T-26
generous
series of
woman
tanks.
of
Let's
my
combine
life.
them into one new type of model.
Yeah, she was always good.
Now he goes away, the first prototype of his
You
new
know.
model, it goes through another development. It's got thicker armour on it, T40, it's got a bit of a thicker armour on there in the first place.
What did I
They
do for
start
you
looking
this
at a
year? I
bigger
didn't do
gun,
nothing for you.
They improve on
I
that
existed.
newer model,
Is that good
and
enough?
ultimately that becomes
guess
really
so.
the prototype of what becomes a T-34. Now Koshkin calls it the T-34.
Oh, you
because
must
he
smile
dates
every
back
single
to
time you see me.
1934 is the time he's
Oh,
first
man.
thinking of
Well, I
some
love
of the
you
ideas
too.
and the theories that go into that T-34 tank. So what's he come up with? He comes up with a tank that has a 76.2mm gun on it. It's about a 3-inch gun, and that's big for tanks at the time. He comes up with, he's already got the idea of the sloped armour. Sloped armour's been
bunch
around
of
for a while,
stupid-ass numbers.
but the level of protection now is quite considerably more that he puts on this first model T-34. And another issue, just like the American Sherman, during the production run of T-34, the levels of armour protection go up. They almost double during its production run. He gets this V12 diesel engine, V2K engine, that goes in the back of this vehicle. Diesel engine, aluminium block. The designer of that engine ends up in 1938, a guy called Chelpin, ends up being shot in one of Russia's or Stalin's purges. It's got a transmission system that is at the beginning fairly rough and ready.
I'm
but
buying
again,
some
through
Dirt
the process of
Rally
manufacture, starts
2.0
improving.
maps,
And
man.
this first prototype
So-
is sent out on the road for a 2,000-kilometre road trip. They go from Kharkov, they visit Moscow, they show the vehicle.
So we're gonna have
to the
a
Kremlin,
time, man.
To Stalin, and
I don't know.
it's taken around the houses. And again, obviously, in that sort of
Oh,
early.
I'm getting
driving,
Finland,
some
Germany,
transmission teething troubles come out. Further changes have
and
been
the
made.
UK.
Now there's an onus now on the development of this tank because already, even though there's been doubters about do we want to go this big, heavy, it's about a 28-ton vehicle, Do we want that amount of firepower? You've got the people building the KV-1, KV-2 tanks. They're looking at as if to say, hang on a second, this is a rival for us, we don't like the idea. There's people in the Red Army are saying, no, it would be much more sensible for the Soviet economy to perfect and keep on building the BT and the T-26 series of vehicles. But what's happening is the Winter War, 39 to 40, shows again, as did Khalkhin Gol and Lake Kazan battles at the end of the 30s, the weakness of those designs. And of course, in May of 1940, with the German invasion of France, Blitzkrieg, we see then, or the Russians see, the use of new armour and the way that the Germans are using vehicles like the Panzer III and the Panzer IV.
Yeah,
so
that was good.
Now all of a sudden that T-34, there's an emphasis behind it, and by September of 1940, the very first production vehicles are now starting to come out. Koshkin, the
1272 out the
designer,
tax.
in September when those first vehicles are being issued, and his role as a developer
Alright, good. Working
of
out.
the T-34 is then taken
Download
over
that crap
by the chap
Steam.
who's been building
Download it
the
on my
transmission.
M.2.
So he ends up looking after the
Yeah, no
development
problem.
of the T-34 through
That's
into
it.
the T-34-85. Now that T-34 tank, the early models,
It will be
like so many tanks,
installed
they had a
on-
number of failures. I've already mentioned metallurgy. That consistently becomes a problem for the Russians. Transmissions. There's photographs of some of the early T-34s driving around with a spare transmission literally bolted to the rear of the vehicle because there were so many failures, so you took a spare one with you. They have a number of problems there with that vehicle.
I don't know how long I'm gonna play this crap.
About 900
I should be playing
are in
PvP.
service by the summer of
But
1941,
I feel like
when of course
trying
here
a
comes
little bit
Operation
of this out
Barbarossa
for a little while.
and the Germans invade the Soviet Union. There's about 500 KV-1 tanks ready at about that time. The vast majority of this enormous Soviet tank fleet at the time is still BT tanks or the T-26 series of tanks in huge tens of thousands of numbers. Now the Red Army that meets that German invasion in the summer of 1941 has gone through, in the late 1930s, a series of purges from Stalin. He's got rid of at least 35,000 officers. It's getting new equipment. It's starting
I'm
to come
seriously
into service.
wondering.
It has expanded massively and rapidly with this
I got
threat of a
Finland.
German war on the
That's
horizon.
Germany.
Originally, it was being built up.
I don't see the
much more
UK
along the
yet,
lines
so
of
I must
traditional
not
enemy
have
was going to be
downloaded
there.
yet.
Poland. Then all of a sudden,
Something like
Stalin
that.
has got
Oh,
this
there it is.
Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. He's done
Honestly, I want to try out the UK
some say
first.
that's to bite him more time. Some say just
So
naivety.
UK says medium
he's got
grow.
an extra year or so.
Okay.
But that
Alright.
Russian
Smooth
army is
asphalt,
described
concrete,
as a
cobblestone,
stumbling colossus.
Germany.
It is not in a very
Light
fit
gravel
state
for Finland.
to fight
Alright.
the war that is coming its way, even though it's got some of these new vehicles coming into service. Now this tank, the
Look at that.
T-34-76, again, we hear great stories about it in terms of when the Germans first encounter it, they're absolutely amazed at the thickness of its armour, the power of its gun. But
The UK
tactically,
offers,
it's used very
hold on, I
poorly
gotta
by
fix
the Red
this up.
Army. What tends to happen, and some of this is due to the design and the crew ergonomics of it, but these guys who are driving these vehicles have had very little experience on the vehicle. Command, control, and leadership is frankly abysmal at the time.
I
in the
tell you
Red
what,
Army.
I don't know.
And so even though
That
there's some
downloaded pretty damn
outstanding
fast.
examples of
That got on my
T-34s,
account wicked
doing heroic
fast, man.
actions, holding up enormous German forces, statistically, really most of them, about half of them, are breaking down before they even get into action. And that problem is, as I mentioned, some of it as well is to do with the design. So, for example, when we look at this vehicle, the early model T-34s with that turret, that's a two-man turret. Now, I'm not that big a bloke, but I couldn't even fit my shoulders into that turret across the rear there. So how two guys are supposed to be in there, the commander and also the gunner is supposed to fit in that very tight space, you know, that is a cramped area there. The other issue, the commander doesn't have a cupola, so his actual vision from inside that vehicle, he's got one periscope. And again, the Germans report on the fact that quite often they could get 3 aimed accurate rounds off for every one that the Soviets are firing. and only platoon commanders' vehicles have a radio.
That isn't too bad.
So these vehicles in a
Maybe
platoon
I'll
are
buy,
similar
like-
to each other, either with flags, and as you can imagine under fire, the last thing you want to be doing is opening up your action
Honestly, I
starting
don't
to do
even
flag
know.
signals. So again,
Maybe
some of
some-
these early
maybe
accounts,
some
the Germans are
basics.
reporting on these tanks almost following each other around, not being very tactically aware, not using
I don't
very
mean
thick
anything,
armour
really,
that they've got
honestly.
comparatively at the time, and their impressive firepower to great effect. Now the early model L11
Be right
gun,
back in
6.2
30
millimeter
seconds.
gun, a design bureau, the Grady Design Bureau in Russia ends up coming up with a better design. They call it the F-34 gun, and they are not given official permission to start producing this gun, but they go ahead anyway. And it's only because of the good reports on this newer gun, with its better penetration that comes back from the front line, that starts being added to the 1941 model of the T-34. So again, it's part of this story that as the T-34 goes through its development, it goes through a number of changes. Now that gun, firing an armour-piercing composite rigid round, in other words, a slug of something like tungsten within a wider 76.2 millimeter sheath, that round could go through 90 millimeters of armour plate at about 500 meters. And you have to think in the summer of 41, if you're looking at the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, most of those tanks, maximum, you've got about 60 millimeters of armour. So that's a very effective tank killing gun early in the campaign. We've mentioned about reliability, that diesel engine in the rear, wide tracks. Tracks, of course, the Russians know about Russian winters, and of course there's not that many metalled roads, surface roads in Russia. So the idea of the wide track to spread the weight, and that engine gives this vehicle a power that can speed it up to about 33 miles an hour. So that's a good turn of speed for about what turns out to be a 28 short ton tank. So it's still a fairly weighty tank there. Now the German invasion in the summer of 1941 causes something that again almost adds this magic to the T-34 story. They've got to move some of the factories that are now making the T-34 out the way of the advancing German military, and they take them back behind the Ural Mountains. And that means not only taking the machinery, taking bits of equipment, that means taking the engineers, the people that are manufacturing, men and women, are actually drawn back to re-establish their factories and keep this production going.
I can
And
have
in that
I can have a
process, one of the
cigarette.
things the Russians find is they say, look, we're not going to do anything to that vehicle unless
One every
even though they know
45
it's got
seconds.
weaknesses,
45
unless
minutes.
it speeds production or it lessens cost, because we need those vehicles now. The Russians in 1941, can you believe this is a figure?
Yeah, and then they move their
used
factories more east.
20,000 tanks in that German advance. They have a lot of tanks that they need to build, and they need to build quickly.
We got.
So with that movement of the
Oh,
factories
my God.
starts this process